So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to another custom map with a new setup for a battle that I have been given. I believe, based on the factions involved and based on the name of the battle as well, that we are looking at the River Carnan right now, though it is going to be merely window dressing on the battle as a whole because this is called the Dale Outpost. So not dissimilar to some of the other outpost maps that we've seen, the Cardland Outpost, the Arthedain Outpost, similar sorts of things, and all of them do have a tendency to be cityscape style battles with more natural fortifications and then a little bit of an urban setting as well, and that's how these siege battles tend to work out. And this one is no different, though there is a little bit more verticality with this one, perhaps with several layers to dig into for the defenders, and it is going to be a good versus evil siege, at least I believe so based on a cursory glance of the factions that I've seen so far. And it's going to be a 4v4 as well, so that is going to give the defenders maybe a little bit more of a chance, though individual quality is going to be compromised a little bit, you would suggest. And this is where the vast majority of the battle is going to take place, I would suggest, in this corner. There's going to be several ways in by the looks of things, with maybe a pathway leading through the woods over here as well, so several ways in the outer settlement over here and then a pathway that leads through the mountains as well, so it's not going to become a one-dimensional siege by any means, which is a good thing because often those can tend to be overly grindy perhaps, but it's good to see that that will not be the case this time around. But we'll go through the attacking armies first and foremost, as the north is being contested by Sauron's minions. Speaking of which, it's not good versus evil. Anything but good versus evil. In fact, it may... Well, I was going to say, there's not even a geographical border that I can put on this, to be honest. I don't think there's a single evil faction on the field, actually. Weird. So, a strange kind of civil war, this, but the Dalians in the north are being contested now. The dwarves calling upon some favours, perhaps, from their allies further southward in Gondor and Rohan to try and wrest control away from the Dalians and their elven overlords. I'm really stretching for a theme here. But yes, T.S. Niehoff is going to be playing as Gondor. Gondor, as we see time and time again, are a very dependable faction in a siege battle because of their more defensive focuses. We do have the Athelian Rangers in here, tend to be more of a necessity for attackers in the current version of the game, still the old version of the game, this one after all. But they can still be very useful for the attackers, and it does mean that if the defenders dig into the wrong location, they can really find themselves paying quite dearly for that. We will see if that proves to be the case this time around. Units like the Veterans of Osgiliath as well. This settlement isn't super open, there's a decent amount of cover, but there is still opportunity for the attackers to get in position with these archers and try and engage in a protracted skirmish fight. Gondor, one of the very best at engaging in those kind of battles, and the Veterans of Osgiliath themselves, fully upgraded as they are, really the centrepiece of those efforts. There's also the standard fully upgraded Gondor archers here as well, which add into that. Probably the most efficient, really, of the mainline Gondorian units, just because Gondor do have that skirmishing focus. Fountain Guard, probably going to be one of the units which is focused down more so by the defenders because they represent such a threat. Not only are they a really good anchor to the Gondorian line, but they're also very damaging for a unit of this type as well. So you really do need to be dealing with them and not allowing them to really grind your defensive lines down. Speaking of which, there's more of them back here with yet more of a defensive styled unit that is bolstered by armour piercing in the Citadel Guard, high tier spears, and given some of the defenders being Dale and the more heavily armoured aspects of the Dorwinion army, they will be effective there, though less so against the elves from Dorwinion and against Mirkwood and the like. Pelagia Marines, always a useful kind of unit for the attackers to try and rely upon. They're a little bit basic and a little bit more expensive than the likes of the Orc Javelins from the evil factions that, because of how cheap they are, they very rarely go to waste, whereas the Pelagia Marines, because of the slightly higher cost, you do have to be a little bit more careful with them, but the same principle will apply here. Slow but sure damage over a longer period of time with that kind of javelin rather than the higher tier ones. A trebuchet crew with the trebuchets themselves, once again, similar to the Rangers really, it's all going to come down to positioning for the defenders. They can make life really very difficult for the trebuchets, or if they park themselves right in the way, the attackers could have a field day with this. Got the Wards of Minas Ithil in there as well, armour-piercing archers, more of a damage-focused archer this though in comparison to the armour-clad heavy archers that Gondor usually traffic in. They do have a few exceptions to that, and the Wards of Minas Ithil, with the damage spikes that they offer, going to be very useful. Marksman of Caer-Andros as well, a little bit less defensively sound than the veterans because of the lack of a shield, but a two-handed sword in melee does make up for that in other ways in melee. Some more Marksman of Caer-Andros, some standard Gondor infantry with the full upgrades as well in this kind of setting. They're pretty useful because of their ability to take a beating. They're not the most damaging unit in the world, but they will do a job in this setting. An Axeman of Lasarnak here as well. We already mentioned the benefits of armor piercing, and this is a more traditional armor piercing unit. Very good attacking values though. Their defensive fragilities, even though offset slightly by Gondor's heightened armor, could still be called into question here against the defending archers. Then we have Hidden playing as one of the two Dwarven armies on the attack today. The Dwarves can be pretty scary when they're on the attack, and Khazad-Dum, of course, with their quality, going to be a problem perhaps for the defenders. 4th Legion Shield Guard with the armour upgrades here, one of the very best frontline spear units for all-purpose combat. They do have the same sort of drawbacks though because of their higher quality, and of course the armour upgrade making them very, very tanky as well. They do tend to offset most of the standard spear drawbacks. Warriors of Khazad-Dum are a basic unit, but as is very often said, even though they are effectively the entry-level Dwarven infantry unit, it still outstrips other units from other factions of this type and price point. Dwarven Miners, armour piercing as a militia unit is all well and good, but they are still a little bit fragile for my liking. Probably one of the least efficient militia units the game has to offer though. They are still the cheapest of the Dwarven infantry, so if you do need to pad out your army with numbers a little bit, that is really your only option. More 4th Legion and more warriors. We have the Sons of the Fallen over here as well, which are the higher tier unit of spears the dwarves have to offer. Not quite a bodyguard tier unit, they're not multiple HP, but they are as close as can be without qualifying. Very, very strong spears, of course, very tough to kill, though once again they are still subject to the malices that spears are subject to. Khazad-Dum Reclaimers, throwing projectiles, we already mentioned with the Pelagia Marines how useful they can be. A little bit more punch in the Khazad-Dum Reclaimers though, both at range with their very savage throwing axes and in melee with the larger two-handed axe that they then pull out and wield. We have some Orc Hunters of Khazad-Dum here as well for more long-range skirmishing. Decent damage on them, comparable maybe to entry-level Elven Archers. Khazad-Dum Reclaimers here once more. More armour piercing as well from the 2nd Legion Axe Guard, so they're not going to be wanting for that, the attackers. Though they are going to need maybe a little bit more finesse to deal with the elves if the elves are able to get comfortable. Fully upgraded 3rd Legion, however, along with the 4th Legion, we've already seen a one such remedy for that, given their very high defensive stats and their ability to be efficient even under elven arrow fire, to a certain extent anyway. More Sons of the Fallen. The locked morale on the Hammers of Gundabad may very well come into effect. The attackers, after all, very often put their morale at more risk than the defenders, so putting them into hopeless situations, at least temporarily, will not be disastrous for them. More 2nd Legion, some sentries as well. Pikes, we've already mentioned how polearms can be very useful. They may lack the punch of the Fountain Guard, but they are more typical of what you would expect from a unit of pikes. Another unit of hammers, and back here we have the 3 hit point Mithril Guard. Very, very strong, of course. We'll see how they get on under the kind of duress they will inevitably be put under. Then we have Hertumihai playing as Rohan, a very different kind of faction. Of course, their defensive values are significantly lower, though they will be able to bring a larger army, and numbers are always going to be necessary for attackers, and they do have some very damaging units as well. Westmark infantry and spears are actually pretty good for their price point as well, especially in terms of the damage they're capable of dealing relative to other units that are similar. They may lack a little bit in terms of defensive values, not too dissimilar to the kind of offerings that you might see from Harad or Rudour even. But the Westmark infantry here will be hoping to get up close and personal, and they will actually maybe be a better match against lower tier elven units than some of the units we've already seen. Though something along the lines of something we've already seen is yet more armour-piercing shock infantry. The Westmark Marshals fall in nicely alongside the Axemen of Lasarnak and the 2nd Legion Axe Guard that we've already seen. So they're not wanting for that, certainly. The more heavily armoured aspects of the defending armies is certainly going to be put under a lot of pressure. And then we also have the lower tier Riddermark Axemen variant as well. Of course, while armour piercing is the name of the game with two-handed axes, they do still have very good base damage, which, as part of a combined arms front line, may be one way to overwhelm elven and melee defense values. Riddermark archers are very basic, but again, for the attackers, all that really matters is engaging at range and offering them as support, and then pushing through with other kinds of units. And in all fairness, the Helmingas over here are going to be a little bit better in a protracted skirmish as well. Shielded, more heavily armoured than the Riddermarks we've already seen, and a little bit more damaging as well. Eastmark Spearmen are a very cheap unit of javelins. They're a kind of a weird unit, but considering how cheap they are, you really do want to be bringing them, I think, because it does offer an option which the defenders are not just going to be able to completely discount. I've said time and again that the Shield Maidens of Rohan are, in my opinion, the best unit Rohan have to offer, because throwing axes are very good in this version of the game, and yeah, Shield Maidens fill that void very, very nicely. And it's also one way Rohan can counteract phalanxes. It's one way they can do a lot of damage very quickly to front lines, which maybe aren't going their way, which is more common than you'd like. Rohan, as I've said several times, I think are the weakest faction in this version of the game. A couple of units of Riddermark skirmishers. They can be used as footbound javelins, or they can be used for mopping up cavalry that has sallied out, which may be necessary. It is, after all, true that we don't know how much defensive cavalry there is, but Gondor haven't brought any of theirs, and of course the dwarves are somewhat lacking in that regard for the most part. And then we also have the very high tier javelins, the Metacell Guard. They twin their very good range damage with being very solid melee infantry. The Helm's Hammers, however, dedicated melee infantry with armour piercing attacks. And now for the final attacking army, we have Tommy the Unwise. He has officially changed his name. That's interesting. Unless it's someone else, that's always a possibility, of course, knowing what Steam is like. Playing as Erebor, the other Dwarven faction, so yeah, more heavy metal going to be heading towards the defenders. Ironfoot Warriors with the armour upgrade. We've already mentioned how the Warriors of Khazad-Dum can be very efficient. Ironfoot Warriors, perhaps even more so, with the armour upgrades. We have the bodyguard units as well. Dragon Slayers of Ered Mithrin offer that armour piercing, yet more armour piercing, as well as the Sons of Durin. No danger of armour really being the primary problem for the attackers here, now is there? Ironfoot Axe Throwers, we've already mentioned how Axe Throwers can be strong with the Shield Maidens. The same applies to the Ironfoots, only they're probably a little bit better at defending themselves, in all fairness, with the armour. Crossbows as well, they're taking the mountain path, so they will have a little bit more elevation to play with, and if crossbows can get in position, very often that spells doom for defenders, regardless of what kind of setup the map is on. Erebor Legionaries, high tier line infantry unit, going to be very important, this kind of unit, like I said, to try and withstand the Elven barrage as it attacks them. We also have more Axe Guard of Erebor, so yeah, more armour piercing, plenty of Ironfoot Warriors as well, and Ironfoot Spear. So more of a numbers focused approach this perhaps from Tommy, but I quite like this because having more of these basic Ironfoots means you're going to have the numbers to sustain an attack for a long time, and they should be quite efficient in this situation. And you do still have the high quality that dwarves are going to be rolling with, you just haven't overdone it, which I think is quite refreshing. Now then, on to the defenders, starting off with Mirkwood, played by Zelhain. Of course, the defenders are going to have per army a little bit less quality, you'd imagine, given that it is a 4v4. But the elves are going to be very key here for the reasons I've already mentioned. The high focus on armour piercing means a faction like Mirkwood should do quite well. Blades of Amenduir are basic, and they should be quite efficient against most units they come up against. Though getting overrun and overwhelmed and mass pushed is a concern for a unit like this. They can only be a part of a front line. Time and again we see this kind of unit attempt to hold the line on their own, and that's where their weaknesses can start to shine through, but they can be really efficient as long as it's part of a combined effort. We have the Elven King's Palace Guard here, one of the fan favourite units as always, probably one of the most well-rounded units the game has to offer as well. Armour piercing, good anti-cavalry bonus because they're technically spearmen, really high base damage, really high base melee defence as well. Not really any obvious weaknesses to this unit, other than the fact that they're very expensive, of course, and very limited in terms of numbers, but they should do pretty well here against pretty much anyone that comes up against them. But again, support is necessary, given Mirkwood's army size is what it is. Hiri Peng, already mentioned a little bit in going through the attacking armies as well, how important the range support for the defenders is going to be. It often is in a siege battle, but especially in this situation, I think. Target selection going to be critical as well. You don't want to be really just hoofing all of these arrows into shielded units. Where you can, you really want to be targeting down those juicy units of shock infantry. We'll see if the Hiri Peng and other archer units are capable of doing that. Greenwood Rangers in the background over there, of course, Rangers can be used as a crutch still. And for now, given the way the game is balanced, rightly so, we have some Ents in here as well. Timing is going to be important. This is actually a unit which will really suffer at the hands of all the shock infantry we've seen, so that's worth bearing in mind too. Woodland Realm Axemen in and amongst the Spears of Amenduir, the Spearman variant of what we've already seen. The Silverthorns, which is always hard to judge the effectiveness of the Silverthorn arrows in a situation like this, but they do help break up an advance, and a mass push can be made a little bit more difficult by them. But generally speaking, the base damage and of course their effectiveness in melee is why the Elders of the Elven King are very often picked. A couple of units of blades, and there's very likely going to be hidden units scattered throughout as well, knowing Mirkwood are what they are. Then we have Adin Men, who sent me this battle replay, so big thank you to him, playing as Dorwinion. Plenty of Elvelyn, The armoured human units are not going to enjoy the kind of forces that are going to be coming up against them, but they're just here to facilitate the damage that the elven units tend to be able to do, as well as some of the really high tier human ones. Morroquendi pikes for holding the line. Going to be important here. It is fair to say that while there are phalanx units on the attack, for the most part it's much more of an aggressive force, so if they can hold the line effectively, then pikes such as the Morroquendi could be super effective in this kind of situation, in all fairness. Keldrin River Patrol offer a cheap but effective javelin unit in this kind of situation, especially given the kind of positions they could be able to take up. And then over here, the rest of the army, we have a couple of units of Morroquendi bows, poison projectiles. We already briefly mentioned morale. Not going to be the easiest task to rout the dwarves, especially not Khazad-Dum, but Gondor and Rohan maybe a little bit more susceptible to this sort of thing if the battle starts to go sideways for them, and some Helvellyn marksmen as well. So skirmishing shouldn't be too much of a concern for the defenders, but they will want to avoid that if they are at all able. Then we have Portalena, who is going to be playing as Dale. A couple of units of DALIAN bowmen, unupgraded as they are, but that's not really the most important thing. I think based on the kind of factions that are on the defence, they should be well stocked if they have to engage in a skirmish battle, but they will be trying to avoid that, of course, if they can. There's a gap here, which, yeah, it's the Athala Rangers. Nothing surprising about that at all. Rangers need to be brought in as higher quantities as possible in this version of the game. Swordmasters of Esgaroth give them a little bit more of a damage dealing option. We've already mentioned how anchoring the front lines is going to be very important, and that's what the Barding Herd should be very, very good at. We've also got several units of dismounted Earls. Now all of these units are heavily armoured, of course, pretty expensive as well, so good opportunity for all that armour-piercing shock that the attackers have to really clean up in terms of value. DALIAN Paladins, the armour-piercing arrows from the Blackshot Dragon Slayers, and the slightly more defensively minded DALIAN Royal Guard, which is where the general is. So really nothing too surprising about this Dale army, to be fair. Lots really dumped into the high tier quality that they can possess, which, I don't know, we'll see. The armour may prove to be a bit of an issue there. And last, but by no means least, we have Medexa playing as Arthedain. They've come quite a way, battling off against their sister kingdom today. Civilians have even been pressed into service. You can see the difference between the two sides. Over on the other side, Gondor were able to afford their armour upgrades as a result of it being a 4v4, however Arthedain cannot, nor could Mirkwood. So standard Arthedain men-at-arms. There's nothing wrong with them as a unit, but they're definitely just a line holder. Very much like most of the Western Kingdoms, this kind of unit can be very underwhelming in terms of the damage it can do, but of course that isn't their main focus. Yet more armour-piercing arrows going to be flying through the air in this battle as well. Unsurprising perhaps to see the Wardens of the North, though, given how Arthedain operate. Plenty of damage at range that they can dish out. Dunedain Peacekeepers tend to do better against lighter units, and obviously with Gondor and the two dwarven factions, the armour focus means that the damage is going to be mitigated somewhat, but they are still going to be a stronger line infantry offering than the men-at-arms, so from a certain point of view it does make sense to bring them. Arthedain marksman going to be trying to skirmish another trebuchet as well, this time a defensive one. Interesting to see which way the artillery duel goes. Whoever wins that could end up in a very good position moving forward in the battle. Plenty more defensive phalanx units as well, lots of Arthedain pikemen, which is not surprising either. We very often see Arthedain go heavily in for this kind of unit. More numbers focused perhaps than the Dalians that also start off outside the walls as well. Dunedain Peacekeepers here in high numbers. Evendim Spearmen with the upgrades as well, a reasonably efficient unit also, so numbers maybe not going to be an issue. Of course Arthedain do have units that can hide. I'd be very surprised not to see Dunedain Rangers and Troll Slayers pop up at some point. But yes, I will probably make a little bit of a cut, as I'm sure there's going to be a little bit of a... Actually, maybe there isn't a grace period in all fairness, we'll see. I'll rejoin regardless when the first blows or rounds are being fired. So I believe this is more a result of a mistake during the grace period than anything else, but nonetheless we will rejoin the battle here because the attackers are very much closing in on all of the entryways to the settlement at this stage. The Riddermark skirmishers somewhat clumsily bumping into the Arthedainians as they move forward, but that's not going to be a good thing for the Riddermark skirmishers because plenty of Dunedain in here as well as civilians, so it's not going to go too well for them, even if they are melee cavalry. But I think this is a result of the formation being rather wide and loose formation also being employed there, so the unit becomes a little bit more unwieldy, and Rohan, in their haste to try and close off this exit to the settlement as quickly as they can once Arthedain are inside, may have had a little bit of a rule break going on there. But having said that, it has only really affected them because, as we can see there, because of the fact they bumped into an area of the line that housed the Dunedain Troll Slayers, only the Riddermark skirmishers have been the ones to fall, so no benefit has been had by Rohan there. But having a look elsewhere, there are plenty of ways into this settlement in all fairness. There's a couple over, well, technically 3 down here in this little section of the settlement, and then over here there is also another way up, which is, again, there's a little bit of a position for archers. Probably less attractive a proposition, that, purely because it's going to be a little bit more open to enemy skirmishers, whereas the ones down here, while the choke points themselves are a little bit narrower perhaps, the opportunity to use defending archers is maybe a little bit more restrictive. A little bit further back, you also have more Quendi bows in a good position. I mean, going across a bridge is always a little bit of a concern, and that's what Erebor are going to have to try and engage in here, because no one is going to stay in this position, but Tommy the Unwise going to have to march into the welcoming arms of Dorwinion's defensive line. Certainly an unenviable task with Elven Archer support. And again, if anyone can take a real beating at range, it is the dwarves, as we have seen time and time again. I still think over here though, with Portolano's DALIAN army moving over here to defend this route presumably, it's going to be pretty tough on the Gondorians if they're the ones moving forward. Dale do have the ability to punch through the kind of armor values the Gondorians often traffic in, but really it's only the Rohirrim that are maybe a little bit more vulnerable to defending archers. Both the Dwarven factions and Gondor among the best at withstanding prolonged exposure to archers in this kind of situation, but the Rohirrim don't have that same ability. Hopefully with the new patch marching ever closer, however, Rohan will be made into a little bit more of a well-rounded faction, though it must be said, armour-wise, among the other Western kingdoms, they will always find themselves lagging a little bit behind outside of the more wild men factions like Dunland and Rudauer. Maybe I did rejoin the battle a little bit fast, given the fact that there's still a bit of manoeuvring going on, but I did say that I would rejoin when the first blows were struck, and they were. It's kind of an interesting map this, though. I'm interested to see how the defenders can approach this. I mean, there's plenty of good positions for their archers to be used, and that often is very much a big difference between their chances of winning and overall being defeated. Gondorian trebuchets over here, that may be a little bit of a concern for Dale as they move into position. DALIAN bowmen, of course. Dale, the ones, according to the map name, fighting on home turf. And even though Dale are very, very good in a skirmish fight, Gondor, to be fair, are also very well suited to this kind of battle. And in a 4v4 siege, Gondor should have the better quality as well. Arthedain pikemen, so mostly Arthedain, the ones taking the lead over here. Mirkwood acting maybe in a little bit more of a supporting role to all the defenders as Dorwinion guard against Erebor's advance and Dale presumably against Gondor. This does mean to me, I think, that the centre of the settlement is the most vulnerable, with many different angles to try and cover. Arthedain may be the ones to be put under the cosh a little bit more so. So Mirkwood may want to think about backing them up the most. Having a little look outside. And those Riddermark skirmishers, like I said, they may have clumsily bumped into those Arthedainian troops outside the walls, but if you're going to bring a cavalry unit, javelin cavalry on the attack is always a good bet, because you can always contain cavalry that's sallying out. But even if you can't, even if there are no cavalry units for you to do that to, you can still use them as regular javelins. But that versatility is key, I think. Khazad-Dum also moving over here. I mean, just having a look, if you're looking at this from an attacking perspective, this position seems like one of the ones that you would want to maybe send a token force up, but you would want to be coming down a little bit more heavily on the central area. That would be just my feelings on the matter. Quendi bows, Wardens of Ammon Lenk also on high. Very good unit, of course, and given the mostly heavily armoured nature of the attackers today, armor piercing always going to be useful. Erebor just poking themselves out from around the corner. Ironfoot warriors thinking better of it. I mean, there's no choice but to use the bridge, which is actually not a terrible thing. It does mean that the mechanical annoyances of trying to get your units across the bridge probably won't rear their ugly heads, but it's still a very narrow position to try and get across, and the pathfinding is still probably not going to be that great. So a missile is going to be the order of the day. DALIAN bowmen in a good position. Not the most damaging archer, but they don't necessarily need to be. 4th Legion shield guard, so Khazad-Dum and Gondor moving this way. Except for the defenders, I think that's actually a good thing, because it means that for the most part anyway, Arthedain will have to deal with Rohan, but only smaller amounts of attackers from the other armies. Does mean that Dale might need a little bit of backup from the likes of Mirkwood, however. So far, I think the Grace Period has probably gone far enough at this point. I know that the attacks are still stacking up, but surely there is no need for such things now. Already very much in position, and probably the opening gambits are going to be a bit of skirmishing back and forth anyway. I think this may be the first sign of intent. 4th Legion shield guard moving forward with some Gondor archers to back them up. A simple opening gambit, perhaps. More archers. Ones of the north this time, on their perch. Plenty of armor-piercing arrows on the defence between themselves and Dale. I want to get a little bit closer. I mean, none of these units maybe are the best choice for shooting just yet. Rohan's still not eager to move forward first until their allies are in place. Erebor still around the side of the cliffside path as well, which means this is almost certainly going to be where we see the first actual encounter on the map, the first intentional damage, you could say. Arthedain marksman already winded, having ran into the settlement. I do understand the need for a grace period in this one, but sometimes people go a little bit far with how long it takes for the battle to actually begin. Especially considering the fact that there wasn't really much of a deployment phase, so much of this has just been ambling into place. DALIAN bowmen taking up a battle stance now that the enemy is so close to them that that is the case. But finally we have something, and the attackers start shooting into the front line prepared by the DALIANs, which surely means, yes indeed, the DALIAN archers will begin shooting as well, skirmishing back and forth, Orc hunters and Gondor archers. Elsewhere then, what is going to be the situation over here with Rohan? Riddermark skirmishers, the first ones to poke their heads into the settlement. Maybe do a little bit of javelin damage to the Emenduir units from Mirkwood, but here Ironfoot crossbows starting to shoot in. I mean, they're in a good position here. Already the Morroquendi bow shooting at this unit of Ironfoot crossbows. I mean, it's not the sort of unit that you can let be, especially seeing as they are in range of the Elvelin that are across the bridge. And Elven archers are capable of dealing enough damage that even the more heavily armoured crossbows that Erebor do traffic in will still be struggling a little bit. Yes, the weirdness at the edges of bridges. Units sinking into the dirt. Dwarves can't afford to sink down much further. They will start moving across. I mean, Ironfoot warriors should have the beating of the basic Elvelin units, especially the Elvelin Vanguard with that spear malice, but there's going to be other units that are going to be the main problem. And the Ironfoot crossbows, a few pot shots being taken at them by the Elvelin marksmen. A couple of units of them and Morroquendi bows. You can hear the Illadans ringing out across the field. Riddermark skirmishers taking a few hits from the spears of Emondwyr early on. But for Rohan it is going to be a little bit of a tricky one, considering the focus the attackers have placed clearly upon moving this way. DALIAN bowmen, some of their arrows bound to be hitting the dirt, but many of them actually finding their marks and going after something like the Khazad-Dum reclaimers. In spite of the very high armour values they do have, they are unshielded and they do represent such a threat at range and in melee that any damage you can do to them will be worthwhile. Further back, Dwarven miners. So the dwarves are the ones really taking the lead over here. Gondor may be acting in more of a supporting role, but to me Gondor probably should be going with Rohan over here. Like I said, a little bit more room to manoeuvre, a little bit more avenues of attack to go down. Even if Gondor does still offer a little bit of support to the dwarves, I think Rohan is going to be in need of that as well. It's going to be a difficult time for Hertug Mihai if he's left to his own devices to try and take on a joint Mirkwood and Arthedain defence here, with the kind of numbers that he's working with. Meanwhile, over here we can see Ironfoot spears and warriors moving forward, poison arrows being brought in, the Morroquendi pikes heading forward with the Elvel, maybe a little bit too front foot from the infantry from Dorwinion. There's no real need for them to be squashing in against the dwarves this aggressively, given the fact that that could end up buckling their own pike formation. But I mean, it's having the desired effect for the most part. These Erebor units trying to push through the pikes, but that combined with the poison arrows may be enough stress to get them to rout, although they are starting to have the desired effect there, mass pushing, as they are usually the preserve of factions like Mordor and Angmar, but the dwarves capable of doing it here against the more lightweight Morroquendi elves. There are Nandor Gladeguard just in behind to mop up any units that do force their way through, but Erebor being very aggressive and continuing to send units forward, so momentum is going to be maintained. It's going to be difficult for Dorwinion to completely turn back Erebor at this point. Though poison projectiles coming from multiple angles, there's also the small matter of these javelins, which that kind of armour piercing damage, but the Morroquendi pikes are routing, so you could see that even though initially it looked like Erebor might falter in that regard, in the end it is Dorwinion whose initial defence has crumbled. Now Morroquendi Glademasters are getting into the action and more Elvelyn infantry is on the way, but I'm sure that Adin Men probably wasn't expecting to have to mount a defence against such an aggressive push so early. I mean, this is a bit of a gamble from Erebor, because it does mean of course they're going kind of all in pretty early on, and if their allies don't do that and Erebor end up failing, then that will ultimately be a significant win for the defenders. But if this works out for Erebor, then all of a sudden the defence of the whole settlement really looks a little bit compromised. Erebor will be able to come to the aid of their allies, Rohan first, and then their fellow dwarves and Gondor afterwards. More Dorwinion units are on the way forwards now. I mean, from a Dorwinion perspective as well, this is all of a sudden panic stations. You're needing to commit pretty much anything you had in reserve to try and turn this Erebor onslaught back. Stuff like the Glademasters will certainly help you to do that, though I did notice the Dragon Slayers of Ered Mithrin are in and amongst things, and they will be certainly attempting to keep themselves in melee against something like the Elvelyn. Palace Guard are on the way forward, so both of these glaive infantry units, very high tier, very well rounded. Both the Palace Guard and the Glademasters are now both in melee against Erebor, and in the lower tier Erebor units, certainly not like being in melee against them. Ironfoot crossbows still moving forward. Can Erebor maintain this, I wonder? The Ants are also on the way forward. Another unit of Morroquendi pikes with more infantry. Erebor legionaries cutting their way through Elvelyn marksmen, so this could still go either way in terms of how this is going to work out. Over here, meanwhile, Riddermark archers trying to take the slower approach with skirmishing. Like I said earlier, there's not really too much Rohan can do other than try and take the slower approach. It's a very difficult thing for them, but with a bit of help from Gondor, perhaps that can change. Over here, meanwhile, we are seeing a little bit of fighting in melee. Warriors of Khazad-Dum, as a very steep hill they've gone up, but it does allow them to get directly into the river patrol. The dismounted Earls of Dale will move downhill to meet them in combat. Warriors of Khazad-Dum. Dismounted Earls as well, but still not a huge amount of movement here. Still perhaps trying to get away with the slower approach. Like I said, a little bit of unity among the attackers may be necessary here, because without that, Erebor can be focused. The defenders can more comfortably commit more units to withstand and contain the Erebor assaults. And I think that's what's ultimately going to be happening here now. I think Erebor is sending another wave across, but with the Ents, with the high tier units that Dorwinion and Mirkwood have applied to the situation, as well as the larger amount of Elvelyn reinforcements to keep the numbers favourable. I think this will be enough to defeat Erebor, and I mean, it was a bold move, and initially it looked like there was going to be a little bit of movement, but like I said, it needs to have more of a team-wide focus. And unfortunately for Tommy, it doesn't look as though that is going to be the case. As much as I can appreciate some hyper-aggression like this, I don't think in the long run that this is going to work out. 9-foot pikes taking damage as they move forwards as well. Balance of forces evenly matched. Defeat seems certain. Marquendi Pikes, the initial unit of Marquendi Pikes that was bulldozed out the way. That is a big loss, in all fairness. Units of Elven Pikes like this are not cheap to come by, but not worth the demise of an entire attacking force. And also this angle of the settlement won't have any sort of pressure being put on it once Erebor have been defeated. 9-foot spears getting rolled as well. Next guard of Erebor routing. Sons of Durin are in there. I mean, in all fairness, the Sons of Durin far and away Erebor's best answer to the Ents, though the Ents have already wrought their havoc, it must be said. Still missiles coming across from the crossbows, and that will be appreciated, I'm sure, by what remains of the dwarves, and more damage will be done. The river patrol of all things coming in to try and meet the challenge of the Dragon Slayers. It's turning into, from a numbers perspective, a little bit hairy for the dwarves at this point. Marquendi bows have fallen silent over there, still a few javelins coming in. The axe throwers, I don't know if they were able to use much of their ammunition at all. They can't have used up all of it, just based on the amount of time that's passed since Erebor's attack begun. They can stay alive in melee for a period, but having to be relied upon as an infantry unit is probably not going to end too well for them. Bows still here. Only 13 in the Palace Guard, so it's not as if they've been able to maintain too much of their own strength here, the defenders. It has cost them. We saw the wreck of this Arthedain trebuchet previous. That's a good point, actually. So yes, Arthedain did win the artillery duel. Don't know how much ammunition they used up doing that, but that's a big win for the defenders. And wheeling artillery into a position over here where it could be at its most useful. The classic DALIAN front line of Earls and Barding Herd being formed. And that'll be enough to keep the basic dwarves in check. Orc Hunters offering their support. Dwarven Miners, 4th Legion. But again, centred around that front line of Earls and Barding Herd, it's going to take something a little bit more to get through here. It's a very dependable front line. The Earls are an upper end unit of line infantry, really, and the Barding Herd a very stocky unit of armour piercing pole arms, exactly the sort of thing which against regular dwarven infantry can really help equalise any gap in quality there may be, and then some, really. Troll Slayers over here offering Dale a little bit of support, and Arthedain feeling comfortable enough to send reinforcements perhaps to help Dale, given the fact that Rohan are going to have to take the slower approach. The Gondorians trying to skirmish back and forth a little bit more so with Arthedain. The skirmish phase still not really over for them, but Rohan, to their credit, going to start trying to pressurise these front lines as well. Riddermark Axemen. What will be their undoing ultimately will be their defensive values, as with any entry-level, sort of lower mid-tier Axemen. Combination of the slightly lower armour values Rohan have to work with and melee defense deficiencies of this class of unit in general, as much as they will be able to do damage to certainly both of these Arthedainian units. Their own defensive frailties will come into play without any sort of support coming their way. And again, same story over here, though against Mirkwood it's a little bit more understandable that these Riddermark Axemen would not be as efficient. They've done damage here, Rohan, but it's still, in terms of casualties, tilted towards Mirkwood. Mirkwood and Rohan both of course lack polearms, but Mirkwood much more well rounded as a faction, and the kind of damage they're capable of doing, especially in that particular matchup with Rohan's armour piercing tendencies. Elders of the Elven King in position here. I mean, to give Erebor their credit, they are still alive, they are still contesting this position over here, but the pikes the last things to come forward, because they were always going to be most vulnerable to any sort of elven missiles, and I'm sure Tommy would have been hoping at the very least that there would have been less of a presence of them over here, perhaps after momentum had been seized and progress through the settlement had been secured, but it hasn't ended up working out that way for Erebor, and now some elven crossfire will be the only thing that awaits these pikes, and final defeat is surely imminent. Still some axe throwers, the crossbows are now moving across as well. So there's still a little bit of life left in Erebor, and at the very least it will require some units like these Nandor Glade Guard and the Alvelin from Dorwinion to remain here a little bit longer before they are then free to reinforce their allies elsewhere in the outpost. Will the necessity to pull back up to this final stand area even exist at this point? If you can focus the attackers into only arriving at you from one direction, then the necessity to pull back may not even be there. Westmark Infantry, in all fairness, Westmark Infantry a far better match to the majority of Mirkwood units that you're likely to see. And they should have the beating actually of the basic Amenduir units. Their damage, and actually it's an instance where their armour as well is going to be significantly stronger. The elves do have that melee defense, but still it's the entry level Mirkwood unit this. Bit of archer support as well. Arthedain reinforcements, these Riddermark Axemen really starting to lose steam. Now you can see the difference between facing off against basic Arthedainians and basic Mirkwood units. The Riddermarks have been able to stay in melee significantly longer. Over yonder, Arthedain pikemen. Gondor finally starting to put some pressure on as well, so we are now seeing every angle of the settlement being pressurised, but it's at the dying embers of the Erebor army, so one of those avenues of attack will be closed off once more. Fully upgraded Gondor infantry though certainly will be fancying their chances against Evendim's spearmen. Fully upgraded or no. Meanwhile, looking a little bit more chaotic over here now. I think maybe the Khazad-Dum dwarves have noticed that something needs to give, maybe a little bit more aggression needs to be forthcoming, and they have managed to smash their way through one of the DALIAN defensive lines, and the other one now being wrapped around as well. 4th Legion Shield Guard, and of course the very, very dangerous Hammers of Gundabad on the way forwards as well. Looking very risky at the moment for Dale. Everything could start to unravel for them. And once again, hyper-dwarven aggression is the thing which is making things happen in the battle. Does it indeed. Athala Rangers probably not going to be here long enough to turn the tide with body-piercing arrows alone. There's a lot of armour piercing in here as well. There's the 2nd Legion, there's the Hammers of Gundabad in the background over here. We see the Gondorian Axemen of Lasarnak, so maybe it's not too surprising that in the end, while they are an efficient front line, the Earls and the Barding Herd, armour focused as they are, ended up losing a lot of ground. Throwing their axes a long way there, the Khazad-Dum reclaimers. Excuse me. Olympics level throwers. And again, I think the dwarves would probably be pretty good at the shot put and the hammer throw when you look at the kind of people that are good at that in real life. Swordmasters of Esgaroth routing the Earls, or the DALIAN Paladins probably won't, but they are in a bit of a sticky situation here, and all of a sudden the attackers do have momentum in this fight, and they do have a route to take towards victory perhaps. It's looking a little bit dicey for them, but the arrival of the Dorwinion reinforcements elsewhere on the field may very well make a big difference. But Gondorians, I think, perhaps seeing that Khazad-Dum are starting to make real progress, maybe starting to turn up the heat on Arthedain down here in the lower section of the city as well. More reinforcements will be needed. Pikes have been committed, some basic Mirkwood units as well, though is that going to be enough? And Rohan content as well to not be as aggressive perhaps, but then they can't really afford to be. But just keeping the pressure on in other areas as well, not allowing the defenders a free retreat. If they're going to retreat, it's going to cost them. And that's exactly the kind of thing they need to keep up. Battle between archers. Woodland Realm Patrol may not be the strongest elven archers in melee, but they will still be significantly stronger than Riddermark archers. And surely that's the end of Erebor now. Though how long they've managed to keep themselves alive for has actually proven to be important, as the attackers are now making headway elsewhere in the settlement, and that would be more difficult for them to do if Dorwinion had been able to go elsewhere. That's very unfortunate for Dorwinion as well, to lose their general. That was basically the last thrust of a pike that Erebor had left in them, and it was enough to run the Dorwinion general through, and morale may yet prove to be an important factor in this battle. Dorwinion's morale is pretty good. Elven units, of course. And the Elvelyn, I mean, they certainly are breakable, but they are well disciplined. As a general rule, you don't see morale be too much of a problem for Dorwinion, but late game, lack of a general will call that into question a little bit more. Meanwhile, Khazad-Dum continuing to roll forwards, Dale having to retreat now. Nice little defensive position this though. Some Arthedain pikes ready to meet the dwarves in battle, and Dale and Arthedain also have their own armour-piercing projectiles now that can be utilised. This is good this though from the attackers, getting their javelins and throwing axes into position to support their allies' push through the lower sections of the settlement. Start really gaining some territory in this battle. Arthedain marksman. Hiri Peng also over here. Defeat is a distinct possibility for Arthedain down here. It's much cleaner fight still between Arthedain and Rohan in the lowest reaches of the settlement, however. Riddermarks, Eastmarks. At the back we've got Westmark Spearmen still, so Rohan still have plenty in reserve as a result of their more restrained approach to the battle so far. None of that is too surprising, of course. The green capes of Rohan moving forwards as well. It's looking a little bit dicey. I mean, Riddermark skirmishers moving in, Dorwinion sending their own units back now, and Elvelyn Vanguard will put an end to any cavalry shenanigans that are happening over here, but this is a key moment of the battle for the defenders. They may have been feeling pretty pleased with themselves when Erebor ultimately, their fate was starting to look sealed, but Khazad-Dum in particular, along with their two human allies over here, have managed to call the defenders' preparedness elsewhere into question. 3rd Legion Infantry, 2nd Legion Axe Guard, once again armour piercing at the forefront, and will be useful against the Dalians and Arthedainians that are manning this front line, though it is going to be the supporting tools in this very nasty position that could end up being the problem here. Only 16 Troll Slayers remain, actually. They're going to want to dump their ammunition as quickly as possible so that it doesn't go to waste. Those kind of projectiles are not the sort of thing you can afford to lose out on, given the battle is developing as it is. Dunedain Peacekeepers. Extra damage will be helpful, though this is exactly where the Gondorian and Khazad-Dum armour will start to pay dividends, surely. There's a lot of room as well now for the defenders to have to cover. There's 2 choke points that Rohan and part of the Gondorian army can start to pressurise as well, and if those fall, all of a sudden Khazad-Dum once again can get rolling. The domino effect will start to come into play, and maybe we will see the final stand after all as we march towards the final 10k frames. Defeat seems certain. Only a military genius could win this battle. Westmark Marshals. Again, the armour piercing not necessarily the be-all and end-all against Mirkwood, but the base damage will still actually be very useful, especially given the maybe slightly flimsy nature that we're starting to see from the defending lines. Units that are slightly battered and bruised, the ones having to take the initiative. Trying to balloon their shots over the wall, the Helmingus. That won't be particularly accurate, nor will it be particularly effective, but the outer layer has been completely taken at this point. Single unit of Citadel Guard going to test the front line over here as well of the Arthedain marksman. 20 bows, blades of Emendouir. You can see actually now that the retreat is already being planned ahead, though I must say, looking at the units they have left, the defenders, the attackers don't have limitless stores of manpower either, especially given the kind of damage that Dale and Arthedain are actually being able to inflict on the front line over here, but defenders' manpower starting to look a little bit ropey. Mithril Guard getting hit with arrows, but they will be able to withstand an awful lot of punishment, of course. Black shots are in melee. As far as out of ammunition archers go, they're going to be pretty handy to have up front. Some routing as well from the Gondorians. Khazad-Dum made of sterner stuff, that will be much more difficult to engender in their ranks, but I would say if you do start to see Khazad-Dum routing en masse, it's a sign that the battle is pretty much done for them, so there is that. Gondorian infantry moving up to help the Citadel Guard, a combination of those 2 units. Again, Troll Slayers though, backing them up on the front line. It may seem like a small engagement this, but any sort of gap that appears in the defending lines at this point and the attackers could pour through and really start to exploit positioning, and the more conservative nature that we've seen from Rohan so far has left their army in a fairly good condition going into the late game, and as much as I will stand by my assessment of them being the weakest faction in the game as it stands, could they be the ones to win the battle for the attackers? Marksman of Caer Andros, so there's also Gondorians marching in step with them. Stuff like the Helm's Hammers being in perfect condition with Shield Maidens as well. If the defenders have got no answer to that sort of thing, it's going to be very difficult for them. Multiple paths that can be taken as well. They're not going to move back to the final stand here, the defenders, because they don't really have enough to make that worthwhile. They need to maintain their current positions. They can't afford to take the losses that retreat would cause them. Mithril Guard still looking fairly healthy. Wardens of the North, a worthier opponent than most, though that's still a fight you would heavily back the Mithril Guard to be just fine in. So far, the Arthedain pikemen have been key to holding back the tide, as it were. Gondor archers, arrows coming in from behind the Hiri Peng, so still this crossfire is underway, and still the fight is not concretely going the way of the defenders, which is a sign, I suppose, of We missed actually the initial phases of Khazad-Dum's push on the outer layer against Dale, but that must have been very, very effective when it happened, more so than the Erebor one we saw across the bridge, as much as I think Tommy actually, in the long run, you'd have to say he ended up doing the right thing. I think the Khazad-Dum one was more effective. Maybe the defenders as well just weren't prepared for another one. So it has proven to be. Westmark Spearmen and Westmark Marshals colliding with the front line. There's not enough Moragwandi bows surely to keep the Rohirrim in check. Grey Company, body piercing projectiles, archers in general, other than the close range crossfire we see over there still going on, and the attacks across the bridge. It's been a little bit difficult to actually keep track of what archers and what specialty projectile units have been super effective and which ones have not. But just based on the manpower the attackers still have left, can you surmise from that that the rangers haven't been as effective as they could have been? DALIAN has fallen, in all fairness. A combination of the Wardens of the North and some Troll Slayers proving to be a worthy foe indeed. Some pretty serious terrain as well. Ethereal Guard, maybe the damage done by the archers, while not lethal, was enough to finish them off. And all of a sudden over here, actually, the defenders look to be winning this front line outright. So there's still a few units over here which may prove to be the sort of thing you can't ignore at this late stage as well. 82 marksmen of Caer-Andros are actually a pretty sizable portion of the attacking force. But now it's looking, if the attackers are going to win this, they will be reliant upon Rohan to finish the job. There's still some Gondorians in and amongst here as well, but Gondor of course have been splitting their support between Rohan and Khazad-Dum, and obviously Khazad-Dum's fate is sealed. The dwarves are pretty much gone at this point. So in the end, it took them a while. They were a tough nut to crack, Khazad-Dum, but that defensive position did a lot of the heavy lifting for the defenders. Now moving further back down here, Citadel Guard, Blades. Grey Company trying to be used as a cudgel now, so they clearly don't have any ammunition, although to go into Eastmark Spearmen, that's probably one of the few instances where those Eastmarks are actually still going to be fairly effective. Dunedain Peacekeepers should be at their strongest actually against Rohan among all of the attacking armies. They need to try and stop these archer units from firing. Ones of Amon Lenk are a strong unit to have left. Greenwood Rangers still with a bit of ammunition. No time for dawdling for her to Mihai. The longer these arrows continue to hit Rohan, it's going to have more of an impact on them than it would have had on any of their allies today. Pikes and Wardens of the North. Arthedain and Dale still. Mirkwood as well. Not looking like there's too much in the way of Dorwinion left. Another sign of the exertions they had in the earlier stages of proceedings. With around patrols still, a lot of these archers. Shieldmaidens of Rohan are a pretty significant unit if they can start targeting down the right kind of thing. Citadel Guard, still the small matter of these Riddermark skirmishers as well. I mean, Helm's Hammers, in all fairness actually, the Wardens of Amon Lank will probably be at their strongest against the Helm's Hammers, the armour piercing. Excuse me. Should do quite well against the heavy duty Rohirrim. Rangers, DALIAN Bowmen. Still some marksmen of Caer-Andros offering their support as well. Could be all of these projectiles. The projectile war should probably go in favour of the defenders still. Yeah, those ones of Amon Lank. I think maybe a mistake in how the Helm's Hammers were deployed could be one of the key factors here late on. If there's one unit I wouldn't have wanted the Helm's Hammers going up against, it probably would have been the Wardens of Amon Lank. Maybe you could say the Dunedain Troll Slayers as well, but they were significantly more thin on the ground. Maybe they should have been over here trying to help deal with Arthedain and Dale, send over some other units perhaps, but the level of quality still is going to be hard for Rohan to maybe deal with. Medicel Guard are over here. Forward come the Marksman of Karandros, colliding with the Hiri Pang. It is a close one, this. The defenders, it is still, I think, going to come down a little bit to the projectiles and how they're still being used. Stuff like the Shield Maidens, if they can be used effectively, could really help turn the tide. Westmark Marshals struggling a bit. Medicel Guard going toe to toe with the DALIAN Royal Guard, though two-handed swords should give the DALIAN Royal Guard a little bit of a leg up in that fight against the shielded nature of the Medicel Guard. And now, are they going to be able to throw those axes, or are the Elders of the Elven King going to get into melee with them? I mean, they will at least get one volley off. Not utterly devastating, but Rohan making a good shake of this. I do think their slightly more fragile nature is probably going to catch up to them here, looking at the lay of the land, but anything is possible. Another armor-piercing archer as well in the wards of Minas Ithil, though this time for the attackers, still with a bit of ammunition. Eastmark Spearmen arriving on the scene, but too late to help the Helm's Hammers, and obviously it's going to be an absolute landslide victory for the Elves against a unit this week. At the back, DALIAN Bowman, Helmingas. Defeat seems certain, only a military genius could win this battle. Elders. Elders will still very much fancy their chances here. I mean, Medicel Guard are very good. Like I said, they're one of those javelin units in the game which is of the highest quality. But it's more because of their nature as an all-rounder. When it comes to having to deal damage in melee, well, they are a bodyguard unit and a very good one at that. The Elders of the Elven King, of the DALIAN Royal Guard, like I said, two-handed swords, gives them that little bit something extra, a little bit of extra damage. You can see here the Elves and Dale starting to look like the more dominant in terms of numbers as well. And Rohan giving it a good shake, but like I said, I don't think they're going to have the staying power here. DALIAN General right in amongst things. Marksman of Karandros losing to the Hiri Pang as well, though that was a very close run fight as also. Another unit of Marksman of Karandros, the Helmingas archers still firing away. Shield Maidens backing up a little bit, Westmark Marshals. More clearly defined lines are being formed once again over here. Technically speaking, we have seen the final stand, I suppose, or at least the entryway to it. Over here, Dale, still with those bowmen. A few units now coming in from the side. Greenwood Rangers used up all their ammunition by the looks of things and are now going to get last samurai'd by the Marksman of Karandros before also being engaged in melee by 90 Helmingas. Arrows flying overhead still. Defeat seems certain for Zalhain's Rangers, but DALIAN Royal Guard moving forward. Not enough of the Westmark Marshals to keep this fight up for too much longer. Hiri Pang. Still some ammunition actually in the Elders of the Elven King as well. Needs must when it comes to using them as infantry earlier, but yeah, just another little factor which is going to put this battle beyond the attackers. The quality and damage of the elves is probably what's going to be enough to see the defenders over the line. Though I will say they actually need to get a better shot onto those Marksmen of Karandros. I would say they're ballooning their shots up into the air, and I mean it's not completely wrapped up yet. Still over 70 Helmingas, still over 70 Marksmen. Still a fair few of these Shield Maidens. So it's not totally sewn up yet. There is a world in which the Marksmen of Karandros do enough damage with their bows that this battle has one final twist. I somewhat doubt it. I still don't think that they're going to have enough when things get up close and personal. But I've been wrong before. Still 53 DALIAN bowmen as well. Maybe with that, it is completely beyond them. Fury Pen moving forwards, and out of ammunition by the looks of things as well are these Caer-Andros marksmen. Silverthorns flying overhead. 3 Helmshammers still alive, with the Rohan General, though their performance, I'm sure that Rohan will be disappointed in that, but it is what it is. If you send a unit against something that it's weak to, then it isn't going to end well for them. Arthedain. The elves, I think, when they're firing arrows in this game, have a tendency to be unable to shut up. More so than any other faction in the game. Them and the Easterlings are particularly bad for it. Helmingas moving forward, trying to go after the DALIAN bowmen. 2 similar kinds of units actually. Riddermark archers on the way forwards. What remains of these Rohirrim? Don't know where these guys came from. Needed to be used slightly earlier, I think. Consolidation of force. But alas, it is too late now. Westmark infantry. And there goes the marksman of Caer-Andros, obviously the Gondorian general, perishing earlier. DALIAN Royal Guard really actually showed how strong they can be in melee as well, against some pretty strong opposition as well. They definitely earned their keep today. Best of all, the DALIAN King is actually still alive as well. Many generals have met an unfortunate end, and it's still possible, I suppose, though less likely against a unit as weak in melee as the Riddermark archers are. DALIAN bowmen are actually chicken. Archers surely going to fall. What remains of the hordes of Minas Ithil. Could try and shoot the DALIAN King. No hits, only misses. And DALIAN Royal Guard. Marksman of Caer-Andros. I thought they'd actually come back from routing for a second and maybe the DALIAN King was in danger, but that's going to be the end. Dead even in terms of percentage of kills, so that just goes to show that all of those routing units pretty much proportionally represent almost perfectly what the attack or what the defenders still have left. Though of course the elven elements of the defenders does mean that their army was always going to be slightly smaller, but yeah, in the end it was that defensive position we can just see off to the left there which bailed the defenders out a little bit, because when the Dwarves of Khazad-Dum really claimed the initiative on that outer layer, it was looking pretty dicey for them, but in the end, javelins, armor-piercing arrows, even just regular archers, when you consider the kind of damage that elves are able to do from the likes of Mirkwood, it was always going to be tough to maintain that assault. And maybe if they had just rearranged the timings a little bit here, the attackers, like if Rohan and Gondor had begun their assault up those 2 hills a little bit quicker, something would have been left of Khazad-Dum, and that would have been too much for the defenders to deal with. If Tommy had maybe waited a little bit longer, then they could have maybe 2-pronged it a little bit with the 2 dwarven armies, and then he still probably would have met the same end, but it would have given Khazad-Dum maybe a little bit more time before having to deal with a little bit of help from the Dorwinion units that were victorious as well. So it's just minor timing tweaks, I think. Given how close the battle was, that's the only thing I can really think of from an attacking perspective. As for the defenders, I think it was all about adaptability here. They were able to adapt to the situation with Erebor pretty quickly, even though they lost initially against Khazad-Dum. They were able to reorganise themselves and get their ducks in a row, and that was ultimately a huge factor in why they ended up being able to go on to win this fight. So yeah, I would say adaptability, the key. Let's see what did the damage for Dorwinion. We were seeing this from their perspective after all. River Patrol doing quite nicely. against the Erebor units that were crossing the bridge, unsurprisingly given the crossfire they had set up, the Morroquendi bows, and this doesn't count any routing they were able to cause with their poison projectiles as well, so big performance from them, and that's not too surprising given what we saw. The rest of the army maybe less so, but much of Dorwinion was bound up in trying to stop Erebor, so whereas the other armies were able to, or had to, face off against human factions which are more numerous, and of course Khazad-Dum. Really, Dorwinion versus Erebor was kind of a pseudo 1v1 almost. Dorwinion did have some stuff left which they were able to commit elsewhere, of course, but for the most part it was just infantry and warm bodies to try and clog up front lines a little bit more so. So yeah, it was what it was. But yeah, big thank you to Added Men for sending this one to me. Always glad to see a new map in the mix. It wasn't exactly a lore-friendly matchup unless you count the DALIANs and the Dwarves having a little bit of a falling out, but regardless of what you think, the DALIANs actually had the last laugh here, so there you go. A little bit of support from the Elves as well. Yeah, interesting one, this. I like the map, actually. It's not massive as far as a siege battle goes, which is actually a good thing, because big siege battles, especially with cityscapes like this, battles can often get lost within them a little bit, whereas this seemed to be pretty much ideally sized. It's big enough to the point where there is still movement required. It's not going to become a grind fest, but it's compact enough to the point where you're not going to get lost within it, like I said. So yeah, whoever made this, I'm not sure who it was, but whoever did, it was a good one, and hopefully more will be forthcoming. As far as what's going to be coming up soon, there's a Battle of the Five Armies one, which will be coming out in the next couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks or so. Got a couple of siege battles as well on the Arthedain outpost, which we haven't seen as a regular siege for quite some time. And there's another map which I completely forget the name of, but we have seen a couple of times before. It's effectively a Harad settlement on the coast. But that's going to be Arnorian defending against 5 evil factions as well. There's one other which completely escapes my mind as well. There's plenty of battles basically in the backlog that we can continue to do. I'm trying to record them all in series as quickly as I can because I'm imminently going to be going away for 3 weeks, but there'll be no worries about that. By the time I'm done with this recording, I should be a little over 2 months ahead of schedule, so that gives me plenty of margin for error for this sort of thing. So yeah, but I do think that a channel update later on in the year, I won't bang on about this too much like I did throughout pretty much the entirety of 2022, but a channel update later on in the year will be something that's necessary, I think, because yeah, as I've said before, it won't really affect the channel too much, but context is still going to be important, and there is the odd chance here and there that maybe later on in the year, particularly towards the tail end of summer, we may have to go down to 1 video a week for a couple of weeks or so, but again, it's not the end of the world. But yeah, I'll stop prattling on. Big thank you to Added Men for sending this one in. Big thank you to whoever it was that created this map. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join.